I have a brief history of the significance and the history of the American musical theater to run down with you. And I'm going to start with Europe, which had these, not really operas, but like Fledermaus, that was an opera, but it was going toward the American musical style, where there was a lot more recitative in it than operas that were sung through all the way, like Aida and others. So opera was for the higher class people during the 19th century, and when they had, big opera theaters in Philadelphia, New York, all over the country, and the members of the audiences who came there were from the upper class. The middle class and the lower class tended not to go to the operas because they were expensive, and they were sort of snobby, shall we say. So, it was the 500 in New York. There were 500 people, they said, that were part of the upper class, and those were known as the 500, and they told the opera companies what to do and where to go. And living on the lower rungs of the society, operettas came along for the regular people. So you didn't have these highfalutin voices and all. It was another step to musical comedy. It was still a lot of Ruritanian romances. Everything happened in Europe. But it was more for the middle class, and instead of arias, they developed the popular song. And the popular song advanced the plot. It told who the characters were. It said what the situations were, and it clued the audience, who didn't have a lot of experience, attending shows, what everything was about. So the plots were still striving for a sense of class in those kinds of shows that were for the middle class and the lower middle class. And the operettas, almost all, took place in Europe. You think about The Student Prince and Mademoiselle Modiste. There were no operettas really about New York or America or anywhere else. And they were not middle class, but they were sort of in a place between middle class and the upper class. So many of the plots talked about young girls of the lower classes, in a Cinderella-type story, meeting a handsome man, and all the things that went on with society and them, and the upper class against the lower class. So it was really for that middle class that these operettas were done. You've all seen Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson, or a lot of you have seen Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy. And it's all very stentorian. Everything is stated in the lyrics. There isn't any real poetry in the lyrics. Stout-hearted men, everything is driving. All the love songs are overly dramatic. You don't hear the kind of stories that became Broadway musicals. And all of them were from Europe. So we had in America a need for an original American musical theater. And going down the society strata was the lower classes, and they had their own kind of theater. They had the burlesque theater, which is not burlesque you think of women stripping. It was burlesques on popular shows. They would do a burlesque on Aida, for example, sort of to knock down the upper class. And the female form was a big part of the burlesque. It wasn't burlesque, again, with strippers, but Irene Castle and all these people, these women, came along, and they wore very tight clothing, and they created sort of cliques of men. You've heard of them waiting at the stage door with flowers and stuff like that. And they were the stars. There were no movies, there was no television. They were the stars. And everybody who in New York, even if they hadn't seen the show, knew who these people were. They really became, just so famous that they had to make something different than just a star. So then we had the secondary couple. You think about Oklahoma, there's the two leads, and then there's the two secondary couples. And so the formula became more of a formula to give more kinds of people, more real type of people, like in Oklahoma, than in Student Prince, which was all, very proper. And the audiences couldn't relate to these people in the same way as they could when Oklahoma came through. So a lot of the shows got their name by spoofing these operas and operettas of the higher class, and they would do parodies of plays and famous performers, important figures in politics. Rodgers and Hart wrote a show called I'd Rather Be Right about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was then president. And the upper classes didn't attend these shows. They were musical theater. But they caught on, and they were tremendously successful with the general public. And they created a whole new audience for theater and it seems like now the audiences are for the lower classes, but that's another story. So in the early days, all the producers had their own theaters. There were theaters all named after them, and they owned the theaters, and all the shows in those theaters were produced by them. But by the end of the 20s, this sort of faded away because there weren't enough people to go to these shows. There were almost 50 shows on Broadway at the same time in the 20s. Vaudeville theaters became Broadway houses because it was big money. And now I think there's down to like 35 theaters on Broadway because of a lot of buildings coming in that tore down historic theaters. Unlike the operas and operettas, the plays and musicals toured the country. The operas never toured, they were just in New York. Ballet companies didn't tour because it was too expensive. But the shows went through the country, and a lot of these shows were making jokes at the pompous upper class and became very successful. And after New York, Chicago was the leading theater city, and they had their own casts, their own culture, completely different from New York. And people from Chicago never made it to New York, and vice versa. They were hometown people that the hometown people wanted to see. Somewhere between the minstrel show and Broadway also were variety shows. And these were haphazard things. Florence Ziegfeld Follies was essentially a variety show with dog acts and famous people and a lot of semi-clad women, which was a very important part. Earl Carroll's Vanities and George White's Scandals all had women wearing a different kind of clothing, let's say, than the average person. And, this was the time when there were societies to keep things clean, and there would be raids on these theaters, which only made them more popular. So the vaudeville started to become edged out by the musicals and by movies also. Because in movies, as we saw this afternoon, you could see anything. And so vaudeville sort of lost its charm and became folded into revues, and in a show like we saw this afternoon where specialty acts would be brought in. All of a sudden there's a dog act in the middle of this movie or something, just to keep, just for entertainment. And there are also expansive skits based on events in the news. I'd Rather Be Right was George M. Cohan playing Franklin Delano Roosevelt on stage during Roosevelt's tenure in the White House. And Roosevelt was all for it. They were really nervous about it, but it was Rodgers and Hart, and it was a classy show, and actually became a movie that was also very popular. But in the 20s also, music was different because you had ragtime, jazz, and the American popular song that all came up during the late 20s and became subsumed into the musical theater of its time. Before that, it was all Ruritanian romance, and all the women were high sopranos, and the men were basso, and things sort of loosened up. And little by little, the American musical became international. And cities outside of the United States, especially England, started putting on companies, and road companies became more viable with the invention of the automobile and better highways and easy ways to get around the town. So people in San Francisco could see a Broadway show on tour, just like we have the Theater Guild tours here that come to Chicago or Detroit or whatever, which were very rare at the time. It was almost all homegrown companies that just worked in their city. But by the 30s, Broadway really expanded. And another influence on the musical was the English music hall. The English had Gilbert and Sullivan, and except for Oliver, very few English shows have come across to Broadway for some reason. It's very strange because they have a great, West End theater culture, but very few of the shows came to the United States until the present time when we have the Andrew Lloyd Webber, I don't know what to call it, but anyway, everybody has different opinions on Andrew Lloyd Webber. He has his own spectacles. He brought spectacles back to the theater, like Cats. Cats would never have been done in the old days where you needed a real plot. You needed, there is a plot, but people who go to the theater to see Cats do not care about the plot. And besides, it's based on a poem. But, and like Les Mis is now is more of an opera than a musical nowadays, except for the Thénardier, which has a funny number in the first act and a funny number in the second act. And it's still an American art form. And I think it's interesting that very few companies have homegrown musicals. If you think about it, Italy had them and France had the operetta, but they never really had musicals. The one musical that made it in the United States is Les Miserables. It's the only French musical, except for Irma la Douce, that I can think of that came from France. And Sweden brought us ABBA, but that was sort of a one-off, let's say. And I was thinking, the French had Marie Chevalier, Jean Gabin, Zizi Jeanmaire, and they had cabaret shows. And they had their kind of vaudeville, and they had a lot of operettas, but they never came to the United States. It's strange that the taste was so different, and now, except for Les Mis, you don't hear about French musicals. There are some, but they don't transfer. And I was also thinking, Why is it that only England and the United States really have a legacy of musical theater? Australia doesn't. You don't think about Canadian musicals coming down. Mexican musicals? There's something in the culture of the United States that makes musicals possible. And I don't know if anybody has any ideas of why that is, but it's culturally so strange. Canada is right next to us. They speak English. They like our musicals, and yet they don't have any real musicals.